everyone's doing well. Happy New Year. I wanted to reach out and say thank you for being patrons. Thank you for your support. Thank you every month. It's been a year and I wanted to do a little bit of a retrospective or looking back. And I thought one of the ways I would do that is through books. As you can see behind me, I have a pretty wide collection. I've got all my, I love the top up there. I've got my rainbow of books up there. And then, of course, I've got all my musical scores, and you see another light behind me, and a DVD collection that I don't use anymore because everything's streaming. So I will try to keep this brief and informative, insightful. I have started doing some interviews. I was doing interviews live, and my goal was to make a podcast of interviews, and the hook or the difference being that I would do mine at the piano. Unlike every other podcast I think I've found, I was thinking more like Marianne McPartland, the old jazz pianist on NPR. She would do interviews and then she would play a little and then talk and play, and she'd have musicians on. So I've been having actors in my apartment across from me at the piano, but of course that has come and gone depending on COVID, and I had interviews lined up. Now I'm talking to you in January. I had interviews lined up and I've had to postpone them again. My goal with that is to get at least 10 or 12 interviews lined up and then release them once a week and have like a limited season. I think doing podcasts and doing web series and doing all the things and blogging, it's all wonderful. The issue I run into is the expectation of that being every week for perpetuity, forever. So I'm going to talk about a couple books, some that I read this year that were great, some that I can come back to. This one, How Sondheim Found His Sound, R.I.P. Mr. Sondheim. I didn't really say or post much when he passed. I would absolutely draw him as my inspiration for a lot of things. I think his ability in lyric writing we all are drawn to because we all speak English, more or less. But what people don't always understand is his music. I think we're drawn to the complexity and we're drawn to the harmonies, but his training goes from Milton Babbitt, who is a serial composer, who was a classically trained composer, and his training was classical. And of course, when he worked with Bernstein on West Side Story, I find connections from West Side to what he did with Sweeney Todd, with motivic transformation, motivic development, which is all very, very classical. If you look at a Beethoven symphony or Mahler or a lot of great examples in classical music. So a lot of times when I listen to people talk about Sondheim, they get very excited about his dramatic abilities, but I often seem to think that we don't know how to speak about his music because a lot of us are not trained in that, and that's okay. Here is a great book if you want to get in the weeds on the music. It's called How Sondheim Found His Sound by Stephen Swain. I'm not going to do a reading for you, but I pulled this out. I was interviewing one of my friends, a colleague of mine who's a Broadway actor, and he and I were talking about Anyone Can Whistle, which was Sondheim's first show, and he talked about, was his very first show? Yeah, it was his first show. Ran 9 performances, I think, with Lee Remick and Angela Lansbury, who, whatever happened to her. The quote, little one I like, is, it says here, "The marvel of Sondheim's melodies is their close motivic unfolding rather than expansive tunefulness, in keeping with the manner in which Western classical music unfolds." I think it's interesting, that little bit that he adheres to classical motivic transformations, classical motivic ideas that keep the music very contained. As opposed to, let's say, larger, bigger, romantic, sweeping melodies like, say, Andrew Lloyd Webber, who ironically steals a lot from Puccini and Mendelssohn, other composers. Sondheim is pretty strict when it comes to what each note does. And I think that strictness also shows up in his lyrics. If you look at the lyrics of his songs, a lot of the lyrical syllables line up so specifically to each melodic note. Simply put, if you add more syllables to a phrase, you have to add more notes, right? So he keeps a very strict melodic phrase, which I think the one informs the other. Anyway, This book, it's full of musical graphs and charts, and it's actually kind of heavy, but if you like Sondheim and you want to get into it, call me, write to me, we'll talk about it. And I'm happy to talk more about that. I also went down the rabbit hole. I love podcasts. As I mentioned, I'm been starting my own. That's going to be a slow burn on the back burner for a while until I get all my interviews. I want to get everything collected before I post it. I listened to an interview that was a true crime podcast, which now I'm thinking of Only Murders in the Building with Steve Martin and Martin Short. I started listening to this podcast about a true murder about William Desmond Taylor, who I'll get back to in a second. But William Desmond Taylor was a director in Hollywood in like 1920. He was killed in 1922, 1921. And the author of the book about which the podcast was based wrote another book as I was researching him. And this was, and I think, it's a pretty cover. We do maybe judge books by their cover. This book is called Behind the Screen: How Gays and Lesbians Shaped Hollywood, 1910-1969 by William Mann. This was a bit of a doorstop. If I'm gonna be honest, it was a heavy read, but it was about the journey of gays and lesbians represented in film, actors and directors like George Cukor, Cary Grant, Marlene Dietrich. In fact, this cover, I believe that's Marlene Dietrich there. And is that Cary Grant? I know you all can tell me. Cole Porter, is he in there? Hang on a second. Oh, good. Jacket photograph. The Countess Dorothy Di Frasso, infamous tape recording party, left to right. We've got Di Frasso, Cary Grant, Betty Furness, Claudette Colbert, Marlene Dietrich, Clifton Webb, Olive McClure, and William Haynes. It's just a really interesting read about how actors traveled through a time where some of them were out and fine and just kind of lived that way. Some people didn't feel comfortable. What's also interesting is how this tracks how, not social media, but media, PR firms were invented, how people created their brands. It was sort of the beginning of all that. So that's a cool read. And on the same note, the podcast that I was talking about, I think it was called Murder in Hollywood or Crimes in Hollywood, was based on this book called Tinseltown by William J. Mann, same guy. And you've got William Desmond Taylor and Mabel. There's Mabel. Mabel Normand. And she, they were friendly. He was much older than her, and people thought they were having an affair. Well, it turned out William was quietly gay. Can you be quietly gay? But he was a well-respected director in New York, and he was killed in a murder that goes, I think it's solved by the end of the book, but it's sort of speculative because it's one of these unsolved true crimes. But what's interesting about his murder coincided with the scandal of Fatty Arbuckle, who was a comedic actor at the time, who was allegedly involved with I think a murder or a rape, but it affected the way Hollywood was viewed, and it was the catalyst that started the code in Hollywood, the Hays Code, which was Hollywood's way of trying to govern themselves and say we can censor ourselves because the government was getting involved, the Catholic Church was getting involved, church ladies were getting involved. There were all these lobby groups in the United States in the early 20s and 30s that forced Hollywood to sort of rein in the hedonism, the partying, if you look at the movies before like 1930, 1934, around that time, they went from being partied and also sort of openly sexual in different ways, like Marlene Dietrich in, I think, Morocco. She kisses a woman and it was, fine, or it was salacious or whatever. But Hollywood put the clamp down like 34 to, I think, 1969 or the late 60s, which is when sort of the span of this book as well. So if you want to get in the weeds about Hollywood, the code, representation in the arts, that interests me because right now we're talking about representation a lot. good. Okay, I'm good on time. I have to go in a minute. So Tinseltown, super fun. There are all these like side stories, and it also talks about the movie houses in New York City between Lowe and is it Max Sennett? No, I'm drawing a blank. But Lowe's is still the movie theater in New York and around the country. Also I'm always thinking about material for musicals, and then I thought, oh right, Mac and Mabel. Mac and Mabel? Yeah, Mac and Mabel Norman. Jerry Herman? Now I need to double check my sources as I'm talking off the top of my head. You'll correct me, I know you will, out there. But it's the story of young Mabel Norman's already been in a musical, and little interesting history. I finally saw Sunset Boulevard, I know, for the first time. And I also have a book somewhere on Billy Wilder. I think it's in that. It's down there. Wilder Times. There's Judy Garland. There's Wilder. Wow. He directed Sunset Boulevard. In Sunset Boulevard, there is Norma Desmond, the aging Broadway star. And that, of course, is a big musical, Sunset Boulevard. Norma Desmond is named after William Desmond Taylor and Mary Normand, the characters, the true story of Tinseltown, the true story of the murder of that director. So she's a made-up character, but in the movie Sunset Boulevard, she is showing the young reporter all the clips of her silent film career, and in there she talks about Mary Normand, and it's like so meta because she's talking about the real-life character, that woman that she's based on. Okay, so Tinseltown, check it out. That one wasn't such a heavy read, but it does get into politics and government censorship. It's kind of interesting. Last but not least, this book was a fun, fantastic thrill to read. Razzle Dazzle, and I did judge it by its cover. Look how shiny that is. By Michael Riedel, as in needle, he says. This book is about the rise of the Schuberts in New York, and how Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs took over the Schuberts. It was in the 50s and 60s. It was sort of a failing company, and many times throughout the 20th century, Broadway was at risk of shutting down, and the Schuberts were the organization in New York. They became the biggest theater company, and they still are the biggest in New York. But the two lawyers, young Bernie Jacobs and Gerald Schoenfeld, took over, and now there's the Schoenfeld Theater and the Jacobs Theater in New York. They saw that the company was failing in like the late 50s, 60s, somewhere around there. Anyway, read the book. What is interesting, though, is that the book opens with this sort of mystery about ice. And ice is the money that scalpers would make on top of a ticket price. So even if back then when tickets were $5, they would call the box office and buy a stack of tickets at $5 and sell them for $50 on the street, or sell them for $45 on the street, and pocket that extra money. And the reason it was called ice is because it would melt away. No one knew where that money went. And back then, Broadway theaters realized that they were at risk of losing all this money because people were making so much money on top of them, which is one of the reasons, not the only, but one of the reasons why ticket prices have skyrocketed. From a friend of mine who conducted Cats in the 80s said it was a big deal when the ticket went up to $100. And then producers in the early 2000s, I think it was $400. And then I heard the same friend of mine say, oh yeah, people are going to see Hugh Jackman in Music Man for $700. So it's absolutely insane. And the other problem is so they get through the early 90s when Disney shows up by the end of this book. And in interviews, Michael says that he wrote this book as a thriller. He was told to write, every chapter with a thriller. And I literally read every chapter thinking, what's going to happen next? So this is a great read about sort of the rise of Broadway, and it also explains why, in my opinion as well, is why it is so corporate and it is so bloody expensive, and why artists like yours truly, there's a lot of theater I'm not going to spend $700 to see Hugh Jackman. I think that's absolutely nutty. Good. I still have a few more minutes, and then I have to go talk to a class about working in art. I also read a couple Did I pull them down? No, I've been reading process books, like art process books. There's a book I read called The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller. I highly recommend that book. It is about dealing with sort of your inner stuff, your inner psyche. I'm a huge proponent of therapy. I think it's really important that we are able to talk about the stuff that you think, oh, maybe I can't talk about that. I think I wrote a song about that. You can check it out in earlier videos. Okay, I will leave you with this. I also read this year Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. I don't have it because I gave it to my father. If he's watching this, I hope you read it. That's also a really deep dive into her studies in shame and our culture around vulnerability and shame and lack thereof. But I do we have to read the quote, right? And this goes towards, I think, anyone who is daring to do anything that is perhaps a little scary, like getting on camera and talking to people this way and having a Patreon. Some days I'm like, here we are. Brene Brown has a great special on Netflix as well. If you don't care to read, you can just watch her show. It's about, 80 minutes, 90 minutes. It's really good. She talks about this quote. This is from Theodore Roosevelt. And the quote is this: "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who, at the best, knows in the end that the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither the victory or defeat." And that was at the Sorbonne, Paris, April 23rd, 1910. I love this. It is a strong, sober reminder for me to consider the source with criticism. And the other point that Brene Brown makes with that quote is, if you're not in the arena and you're not, as she says, getting your ass kicked, I'm not interested. I think it's important to be open to criticism, to receive criticism, but when you have critics who are sitting in it's the Monday morning quarterback who says, I could have done it better, it's not always constructive. So check out her book, check out that quote. I hope I did it some justice. And I will see you all soon. I hope I will make more videos. I've sort of changed a little bit of the platform as to how I feel is best useful for me and my talents. Patreon's great because we can all sort of, everyone that uses it can make it towards their end. People are cooking, people are making workout videos, people are dancing. I'm doing music. I make a lot of videos. I made a lot of videos over Christmas. I hope you got to see those. If you haven't, check them out. They're quick. It's a lot of playing, a lot of Christmas tunes. If you have something that you would like to see me take on or talk about or record, send me a note, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye.